Welcome to In the Arena, a show where entrepreneurs and leaders take us behind the headlines and into the biggest crises of their careers and lives and how they made it to the other side. I'm Genet, a startup founder and your host.
I just imagine him sitting there being so convinced that everyone else in the world was just too scared to do what he did. And that, of course, the rules are wrong and there's no such thing as ethics or morals. There's just power and who's willing to be bold enough to be like really convinced even now until probably the fucking day he dies that he just happened to get caught this time, but he'd do it again 100 times. And only people who like speaking of in the arena, that like this man in the arena to the extreme.
Today, Erik and I are excited to have Nathaniel Whittemore as our guest. Nathaniel had a front row seat to one of the most spectacular scandals in recent startup history when he led marketing at FTX. Nathaniel, to be clear, took no part in the activities that led to FTX's downfall, but his insights and observations are equal parts horrifying and enlightening. Personally, I enjoyed his firsthand account of what it was like to witness so many well-intended employees, many of whom invested heavily into FTX themselves, lose substantial money overnight. It's easy to forget how many vectors of collateral damage there are in a situation like this. This is a hold on to your seat episode, so let's jump right in. Oh, and P.S., Nathaniel runs an amazing podcast network himself called The Breakdown Network. We'll link to his daily shows about AI and Bitcoin in the show notes.
Nathaniel, you have been and remain a long trusted voice in the crypto ecosystem via your writings, your podcasts. You took a marketing role at FTX a few years ago. You did the Super Bowl ad. That was you. You didn't touch anything else besides marketing. You had nothing to do with customer funds.
Correct.
all of this is disclaimer. All the fraud was unknown to you. You cover this in your great podcast episode called Sam Bankman Fraud, where you chronicle exactly how FTX went from 40 billion to nothing within a few days. And we see this episode as a bit of a part two. We want to know exactly what it was like to be in the arena as this was all going down.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. With
that as a backdrop, where were you when you first realized that there might be some fraud going on?
So I know exactly where I was actually because it was quite notable. So I was down in Uruguay, actually. My wife's family has a house down there. We actually got married there. Well, we got married secretly on a boat crossing from San Francisco to Sausalito. But then 2 years later, we had an actual wedding down there. It's a place that's super, super special to her parents, especially. And we actually have the same anniversary as they do. Which is November 4th. We're the fourth generation of Jesse's family to have that anniversary. Wow. And so we'll often celebrate it together. And my daughter's birthday is November 1st. So we always have a big Halloween kind of themed birthday party. So we've been having a grand old week down there, right? Where I was kind of like semi-disengaged. And
lots of personal stuff.
That's fun. Right? Daughter turns 4 with the Ghostbusters birthday party. That was sort of around then was the first inkling. So the Alameda balance sheet was published, I think, on Thursday, which was like November 3rd or 2nd or 3rd. And and I wasn't paying that much attention to it because, like I said, I was kind of one part of my brain out, and Alameda was a frequent albatross, around FTX's neck. I mean, it was something that I had asked about very early before joining was, is there actually kind of separation? And we were always assured that there was. But of course, it was like whenever Alameda came in the news, it was never a good thing. And I think it's quite natural holding us, even if everything had been completely on the up and up for the entirety of the duration of FTX's life, simply having a trading arm as an exchange or something, a closely related trading firm, I think naturally would have beget suspicion about whether they're trading against, the exchange. So it was never something when Alameda kind of innuendo flared up, it was always something that was sort of bad from a PR perspective, but wasn't unreasonable, right? Let's put it that way. And so you kind of wait for it to blow over and you continue to be reassured by Sam that, there's nothing to it, blah, 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 blah. And so I saw that there was something about Alameda, but I didn't dig into it and kind of went on our merry way. Then on Sunday, CZ sends out his tweet basically saying, we're going to liquidate everything. And at first, I think I had the same reaction that everyone at FTX had, which was, this guy's trying to kill us, because he knew exactly what was going to happen. Like that tweet, it was a foregone conclusion that FTT was absolutely fucking dead.
And you're in Uruguay, but like, can you are you sitting on your in-laws' couch? Like what? Just I want the scene. Like I want to know like where, what is it? How what are you experiencing? When it really dawns on you,
Well, so the CZ tweet is happening. We were doing all sorts of various things that Sunday. We're like, you're like doing
activities with your family.
If you really want the visual of this place, it's a place called Jose Ignacio, and there's a restaurant there called Loesia, which has been called like the best seaside restaurant in the world, and it's literally this sort of like Atlantic, like gritty coast, driftwood style. It's kind of like the Hamptons for celebrities from Buenos Aires in Argentina. So like that's that's the setting. And so Sunday that CZ sends these tweets and you watch, FTT start to crater, and a lot of folks have a ton of compensation, including myself in FTT. And so this is a guy who's messing with our money basically, and it feels very hostile. It feels very aggressive. CZ had been getting more and more aggressive with FTX, but Sam had been very loose-lipped with his, attacks on CZ on Twitter as well, including doing some like really, really immature tweets that were sort of notable from a couple weeks before that. And then Carolyn sends her stupid $22 tweet, which again, like this is before there's some big suspicion of wrongdoing or something like that. This is just watching these folks play stupid games on Twitter.
And you're in marketing. And so you're kind of like, do you actually feel some like responsibility where you're like, why?
I don't feel responsibility. I feel like, why the fuck aren't they asking me for like help on whether they should be doing this, right?
And I don't mean personal responsibility. I just mean like some kind of like, hey guys, like clean this up.
At that point, I was like, is there any, like, can I help with the communications? Like, for the love
do you
of
guys
God,
need a hand? Like
yes.
You're kind of like from Uruguay. You're like, hey,
any extra eyeballs on the message before they get sent out.
Do you guys want me to read your tweets or anything? Yeah. Like,
just
I'm here.
Just a nice little double check, like nothing. No, unfortunately, like, and this is in retrospect, there are things that like didn't seem like red flags that are in red flags. And I think everyone at FTX has experienced this. Like the extent to which Sam didn't respect leaders in his own company about basically anything and always assumed that he knew better. Like I couldn't actually have imagined a scenario in which Sam would ask my opinion about whether he should tweet a thing, what it should say. There were like 3 or 4 people who he cared about their opinion, and it was the 3 or 4 people who have basically all pled guilty to various charges at this point. So, but yes, to get into it, Jesse, at that point I was like, okay, these idiots are just again. It seemed like some big ego game, because Sam and CZ had been sniping at each other for weeks,
just like going at each other, and you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna have to like participate in cleaning this up. Is like the feeling maybe at the time.
100%. And so everyone on Slack is the beating heart of how the FTX, community or the team chats, which is, pretty normal. And so everyone's like, there's a rise in tweets, lots and lots of questions, especially after CZ, and people are asking publicly, Sam, what's going on? And this starts to kind of get louder over the course of Sunday night. And
on Slack, you mean?
Yes, on Slack.
Okay.
And where it's very notable to me is it's not that weird that Sam isn't responding to the folks in marketing or whatever, but we started to see the institutional sales folks also asking questions and saying, hey, our big clients who are trading hundreds of millions of dollars a day are asking what's going on. That's when I started to ask myself, like, okay, if he's not talking to us, and he's not talking to the biggest clients of FTX, like, what is he doing and who is he talking to right now?
But then it's a Sunday. So does a part of you as a reasonable person go like, maybe he's at a park? Like, I don't know. I mean, I know it's like a dumb thing to say.
Not with Sam.
But just it's a Sunday. Okay, I'm just checking. If you had any excuses in your mind still.
No. Yeah. I didn't have excuses, but I also didn't have explanations at this point.
You're kind of like in the dark.
Yep. Yeah. And silence is always notable, but it's when there's a crisis situation, I think from any leader. But silence is extra notable when it's someone as loquacious as Sam.
Silence is like strange at this point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Silence is so contra to everything about him. And so then Monday hits, and Monday there's still no information. And it seems like there's a lot of withdrawals happening. Like even people who aren't paying attention to that or don't pay attention to that are starting to get, from various Slack messages that are getting more frantic, like institutional sales team is getting more frantic. But then a thing happens that is sort of the next level for me, which is I started to get messages from other folks in the industry that I knew and had different relationships with, asking if I had heard anything about this emergency FTX raise. And, it doesn't take, look, Sam had been extraordinarily loud with the team about what he said our cash position was, which is basically that we had $2 billion. And this all made sense in the context of, we made about $1 billion in 2021. We were on a pretty similar rate. We hadn't grown, but we hadn't declined significantly in 2022. We had raised, $1.5 billion. So like these numbers tracked and again, it would literally been 2 weeks earlier that he had said, we basically have, $2 billion in cash that we're sitting on. That's why our position is good. And he's like, I'm kind of always constantly thinking about raising more, but it's in the context of, if we want to do and pursue bigger acquisitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Sounds reasonable to a degree, yeah.
Right. So when I start hearing that there's an emergency raise, it literally can only mean one thing, which is that Sam has lied and customer deposits were used, because that's the only in a world in which it's the only plausible explanation. In a world in which customer funds were actually segregated the way that they were supposed to, you don't need to raise money. Like there can be delays and withdrawal. There's all sorts of reasons why things can be slowed, but that those assets are there to be recalled at will. This is not a fractional reserve bank. This is not it is a very fundamentally different thing.
So then going back to Erik's original, there's a moment where that exact thought hits you. Like you said, you hear they're doing this emergency raise. You're not maybe sure if it's true yet. Like this is like chatter effectively, because nothing is just firmly, it's not being announced by SBF or something. But is there a moment for you personally where you go wait, my personal, I've got personal money.
When do you tell your wife, hey?
Yeah, well, I still want to identify this moment where it truly hits you that that's a fraud, that there's potentially a real fraud. And then actually my next question is, who do you tell first? Maybe it's your wife, maybe it's another coworker, but it's just when it really gets in your brain.
Well, our whole family knew. So my in-laws are sort of very plugged into our live, and we talk about this stuff. So they knew on Sunday that I was stressing about it. I was also down in Uruguay with my best friend Jameson and his wife. So they were there, and so they're part of this space as well. At least nominally. And so it was a flutter. But again, at first it was, why are you messing with our money, CZ? And then by Monday it was starting to get much more nervous. And so I think that the logical conclusion when I start, the people that I had heard from around this FTX raise, they're not the type of people who are going to just kind of errantly pass something on. But, I'm not and again, Sam is saying nothing. For all of Monday, they were saying nothing. I think on Monday night, he might have said, hey, sorry, I haven't been able to communicate much. I'm hoping to soon. But then on Tuesday.
And that's on Slack. That's just a weird Slack, which could be written at that point. I don't know how paranoid or your mind wanders. If it's like me, it's at that point that could be written by any someone else. It's just I don't know. If he hasn't been communicating for so long, which is so strange, you start wondering literally what is going on.
Yeah. Well, so Tuesday morning comes around and our withdrawals have stopped. They've been halted for certain assets. And so that's the point at which, all right, it's done. It was the whole Sam lied thing at that point, and that had sort of been the soft conclusion of Monday night and was the large conclusion by Tuesday. And then, 2 hours later, I was right before we were sitting down for lunch. Sam tweets that Binance has bought the company. And this is
Right.
before he said anything on Slack. Everyone in the company finds out that Binance is acquiring us by watching him on Twitter.
Hey, everybody. Erik here with a word from our sponsor, Pesto Tech. Are you finding it time-consuming to hire high-quality remote developers? Pesto Tech is a hiring marketplace that makes finding great remote developers fast and easy. They use large language models to evaluate developers along dozens of parameters, including code quality, performance, and security. All you have to do is answer 5 simple questions on their website, and Pesto Tech will find you world-class remote developers that fit your company's needs. I've heard great things about Pesto Tech from friends like Ryan Hoover, who are investors. So if you need to start hiring developers fast, go to pesto.tech today. That's pesto.tech.
He then says on Slack a few minutes later, hey, I'll tell you more soon. And we have a kind of standing Tuesday all hands. So someone's like, are we going to do the all hands? Get on the all hands. Sam basically says, yep, selling to Binance. Going to need all hands on deck to have them go over our stuff real soon. And it's like,
Does your all hands have like a? So I have more questions about your Slack settings now.
Yeah, right.
Was there like? Is this stuff just happening on like a general channel, like some of these default channels, or were there like creative channel names? I love creative channel names. And then was there like people actively like kind of slacking him, like I don't believe this, or were people trying to still be respectful within the company at that point?
There was a pretty big spread between. So this is all happening on general public channels. I'm sure that every back channel that had access to Sam was absolutely blowing up. And so there's a range of emotions, I think, going on with people, where there's some folks who are trying to rally the troops and, we fight on and whatever. And then there's other folks who are like, you're literally giving us no information still about things. There's a really kind of like tense point because there are a huge number of international folks who have all of their money on there and whose entire lives are kind of intertwined with FTX. And at one point I actually stepped in to ask if people were going to still be getting paid despite all of sort of the withdrawals being halted, because I knew that those folks, like they didn't have the freedom to ask that because they can't like risk, retribution for being the person who steps up and says something on Slack. So it was messy. It was messy. That's
like this dimension. Many companies have blow ups, and there's many crises moments in companies, but often they have personal ramification on people's jobs. Like, I'm going to lose my job. It's going to affect my personal finances. But I do think that just really bringing into focus how this is not just like, I'm going to lose my job. This is people having their entire banking world like tied up in the one entity. And this whole token, everything is actually quite unique. Maybe not as unique in the crypto world, but it just seems like there's it dawning on people that it's not just my job I'm going to lose, but I'm losing funds or my whole livelihood or my access to banking is like so extreme. Like, so I'm just curious if there's any other personal stories you remember from that, of what people were experiencing.
So not as it was happening, because it was sort of something that was pretty far away from me. But it is, in retrospect, one of the more reprehensible things about Sam's behavior was the extent to which he really aggressively pushed people, in the Bahamas and on the Africa team to just keep all their money with FTX. The extent to which, there was a point at which he sort of very quote unquote magnanimously allowed anyone in the company to invest in the company, and FTX was actually like quite stingy with equity, and their compensation was very weird. It was sort of a very low kind of base, but then they promised to have like really crazy kind of bonus cycles, and that was really the only way that people got equity. So it was a lot of hoping that you were good enough that cycle to kind of get equity. And there was this one time around one of the raises where basically Sam was like, hey, you can, anyone in the company can put in up to $250,000. And tons of employees like put their, the $40,000 that they had saved for a down payment because they were a designer, like into FTX equity, because Sam was offering it at half the price basically of, what the current round was. He was offering it at the series, 1A or whatever, and 17 million
Holy
or 17
crap.
billion valuation. So he, like, knowing what he knew and also doing that simultaneously is pretty, I mean, there's a lot of despicable things, but that one was pretty high.
This what you're just saying now, and then in general, like, I don't know if you have the answer to this, but like, what was like HR at FTX like what were they like?
Didn't exist.
Involved. They just didn't exist. Okay.
No, there actually literally was not even a single person.
Really? Like, but actually that really does surprise me. Like, I actually thought it'd be like, you'd just say like, oh, they're like really uninformed or something. Cause it's like, as someone who's run a startup, like, it's hard to get to not have anyone in HR. I mean, employees like really vocally ask for people team contacts and stuff. So I don't like actually kind of like, how does that work? Like, did you do like an exit interview? Like, who sent your paperwork over? Like, if they don't have it, like, how did even those functions work at FTX?
So it was different in different parts of the company. I came in through the Blockfolio acquisition. So Blockfolio had been a marketing consulting client. And so Blockfolio the entire time technically I was actually an employee of Blockfolio the entire time. And Blockfolio had a person for a while who handled those types of details. They weren't really HR, but they were the sort of like operations stuff. FTX had operations folks. They just didn't have anyone who could actually deal with sort of employee needs. And then, in different parts. So when they did the Bahamas thing, I think there were people in the Bahamas who were good at solving HR type issues for the Bahamas and relocation. But again, they weren't like HR. They were, just generic operations people.
I mean, I do just like really find that surprising in the sense that there wasn't more vocal, like, I guess the way they separated employees or had different geographies and stuff maybe helped them have that structure. Just, I don't know. It's just in my experience, like with every hire or something, there's just so much active vocalization of like, we need HR. So it's fascinating.
You have to remember that this was for a time, it was, one of, if not the fastest growing startup, certainly in terms of revenue in history. And it was if you get on the rocket ship, you just cling on for dear life, your nails pedaling along the sides of the walls. Everything in that environment could be written away as just like the utter chaos of what was happening. And
like the Dennis Rodman effect. Like,
yeah, people didn't feel... People didn't feel empowered to ask anything, but they also were like, they didn't feel entitled to, because it was sort of this crazy accidental thing. Mm-hmm. And that was especially amplified by the fact that there was such a fetishization, of small employee count at FTX. Mm-hmm. It was something that, Sam talked constantly about how much FTX did with so few people, that it sort of really got into people's, psyches. I also think too that, I was pretty privileged. Like, I'm a semi-adult with 2 kids who lives in, Hudson Valley, New York, and had kind of determined like I didn't ever want to work for a single company again, and just happened to kind of find my way to FTX. I kept my podcast the whole time as a pre-requirement of joining. And so I was emotionally able to, it was a fascinating experience that I was excited to be a part of. I thought, I've always felt that exchanges are the most powerful institutions in crypto. And I thought that the idea of being able to help drag one to the good, or be a part of kind of, one of the good guys and actually sort of be a force for good, was worth kind of, changing some plans for. But I never had the sort of, this is my big thing, or this is sort of, some like kind of idolization that was sort of much more normal for, a 22-year-old, 23-year-old kid who this is one of their first big things. They're in the Bahamas office. They're feeling all this crazy energy. They're seeing like the most insane wealth around them. Like, it really, it's not surprising to me that, well, it's not surprising, one, that there wasn't more stuff brought up as it was happening, but also, if you've seen kind of people sharing their stories, post FTX, it wasn't like they weren't feeling these things. It was just like they didn't really have the resources to do anything about them. And everything, anyone in that company who tried to kind of move things, positively from a kind of management perspective was pretty systematically shut down.
When did employees turn on SBF? Or publicly challenged to the fact that they publicly lost confidence, or even internally lost confidence?
Sale to CZ. That's when big questions started. It was so outlandish. He still wasn't answering questions. There were huge questions of whether, basically the folks who were still, the folks who had the option to make different decisions, that's the point at which they were like really considering what their options were, I mean, I know for me that week, I was basically sitting on my hands for a couple of days to see, like, is there anything that's going to turn out? I mean, it seemed from the get-go that it was nonsensical that the Binance acquisition was such a farce, and it was clearly a farce. It was even announced as like a handshake deal. There were no terms, Sam admitted that there were no terms, that he didn't know anything. It was like, CZ is absolutely going to take this chance to screw you in public again, even if there aren't things on our books, but it took less than 24 hours. Binance took one look at things and was like, absolutely not. We're out. Goodbye. So like Wednesday, we're here at the same position, and it had really started to calcify behind the scenes. Obviously, a lot of this we've kind of heard separately, but almost immediately when that Binance thing, it was, the U.S. and the international team had always sort of slightly been at loggerheads. Brett, when he was at FTX, really wanted to create true separation, and ultimately sort of was a casualty of that not being allowed by Sam. It was sort of the U.S. legal team in particular were getting, behind the scenes pushing for the outcome, which happened with the bankruptcy. So, it didn't take long.
Yeah, like obviously, well, I'm guessing, you can tell me if I'm wrong, during that week or what have you, you were, traveling with family and these things you've already said. Did you ever go to the Bahamas office or any office? I don't really know where all of the offices might be located, but were you ever like physically there? Like I'm just, again, have this like kind of curiosity about what was normal. So it's easy to talk about what was abnormal now, especially in hindsight, looking back and like all these like bombastic things and fraud, etc. But I'm just curious, did the office have LaCroix? Like what else was normal about this startup? Like, let's just say like in the lens of startups, like what would you say might surprise people by how normal it was before this went down?
So I never went to the Bahamas. Okay. I went to the Chicago office once for a couple of days. That was the only time I met Sam in person. And the Chicago office is a super normal office. To your point, it had all manner of different fizzy water, right, of all flavors. And it's a bunch of young people working really hard and heads down and kind of having little side conversations. I mean, it felt like any other high growth startup that you'd ever been in. The difference between a startup that has product market fit and a startup that doesn't tends to have very little at the early stages to do with whether they're run super well and versus like whether they happen to have product market fit, right? Like you can have strong product market fit startups that are really well run just because that set of leaders happen to be good at running companies, but you can also have the inverse, like really well run companies that just are, still kind of struggling. And so it was sort of like, it was well within the band of normal feeling for people who had been in startups, which are kind of inherently chaotic and stuff, especially when you graded it on the scale of Sam had so much evidence that he was correct based on kind of how the world treated him, that you kind of calibrated his eccentricities in terms of how correct he thought he was about organizational structure and stuff for that. Like the whole time that I was there, I was like, you're a fucking moron about how to run a company, but like, whatever, like, clearly you've been right about a lot of stuff. And totally. That's a problem you could solve day in and day out with high growth startups. I think in some ways, like, Brett leaving was one of the more nerve-wracking moments on that, because it was pretty clear. And for me, there was a point probably 6 months before Brett left. So Brett, for those of you who are listening who don't know the situation, Brett Harrison was the president of the U.S. organization. And I kind of just assumed that Brett was brought in to be like the Sheryl Sandberg. And, Brett's not old. I mean, Brett is actually younger than me by a couple of years, but he's, relative to FTX average age, he had gravitas, he had experience, he had, run teams of 100 people. Like, it seemed like he was brought in to be the adult for the U.S. organization. And so when he left, that was like a moment of, uh-oh. But I think even more than that for me, like I kind of had this, it felt very much like that's what he thought he was coming into. And he very quickly was rebuffed and learned that he too would have no sway in changing anything that Sam wanted to do. And he kind of adapted to that and just kind of, he built like the whole stock product on his own, which is insane for the president of the U.S. organization to be spending like 80% of their time, coding this platform because Sam won't let them have any other coders, So, strange, yeah. So anyways, but again, there's sort of, yeah.
Do two things stand out for me as really outsider that in hindsight seem abnormal to startup culture as well. And I'm curious if they were present in your knowledge at the time. One is all this chatter about like the use of stimulants and drug kind of stuff. Like, I mean, I'm not saying I've never known people who work at startups who use drugs. Like, obviously that's a false statement of mine. But if I were to say that, but I don't know if it was like a strange amount of information about like how this was normal or something like that. So I'm curious if there's any interactions or like any where you see this or anything. And then the second one was political stuff. Like, I definitely feel like it's kind of normal in startup culture for sometimes the founders or executives to be somewhat public about their politics and involve that in company culture a little bit. But it seems like this was like taken to 11, and at least obviously the funding and different things like this. But I'm just curious, all these weird details have spilled out later, but at the time, are either of those things at all like visible to you as a normal employee? And, I don't know, more of a curiosity.
Yeah. So, and maybe let's do this. I'm sorry, I can't help be a podcast host here too. Like, to the extent this conversation could be actually useful for people, it's like, let's almost open up the file for what are things that are real red flags that are meaningful to notice for your own companies or the experiences you have, right? Because I think a lot of folks at FTX have spent a bunch of time thinking about like, what were things that like I couldn't have known, and so I'm not going to feel bad, and I'm not going to bring that to the future. Like I saw again Brett on an interview, I think the first big kind of long form interview he's done about this, and they were like, would you ask to see, would you, now knowing what you knew, would you have asked to see audited financials or whatever? And he was like, well, one, when's the last time you got hired by a startup and said, I can't say yes until I see your financials? And two, it's come out that they were lying about the numbers to auditors. So it's like, what are you going to do? So that's firmly in the category of like, you can't go into every situation assuming that people are this base layer deceptive. Right.
Becoming paranoid isn't the right answer. Yeah.
Right.
It's not.
But there are things, and I'll come back to them, that I think were really very clearly things that I should have listened to that are, I think, probably extractable for other people. So the 2 points that you asked about, one is the amphetamine drug thing. So one, I was, like I said, I was never in the Bahamas, so I don't know if it was more present there. I never even saw this discussed even a little bit. I never heard any sort of behind the scenes. Yeah. Now I was kind of, I had my walls up in terms of like, I did not want to hear gossip from down there. And, to the extent that anyone ever tried to pull me into like, hey, did you hear about this thing that was happening down there? I was like, shut that off as fast as I could. Like, I live here, with my little family for a reason. Like, so I wouldn't have necessarily been the person who would hear about it, but it wasn't a super present thing. Now, I think that, I do think it's a meaningful thing to look into for other companies. There's a whole generation of folks who were brought up on ADHD medication who still have those prescriptions that they don't give out the way that they used to, who are basically grandfathered into that system. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember when we were all in San Francisco in like 2012, 2013, like Adderall was way harder to get than like any other type of drug. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, I think it's kind of normal for startups to have people who are sort of like high, intensity, who are, either not recreational, but just like kind of using those things. I do think, it clearly wasn't the only thing. I don't think that you start to kind of commit this type of fraud just because of that. But it does seem like something that could have meaningfully impacted decision making. I think that those types of drugs impair judgment, so I think it's interesting. On the front of what was the second question? I'm sorry.
The
politics,
like political donations, like these kinds of things where it's like it's not abnormal to have a political stance as a leader, but it feels like
too
it went
fast. So I was not super about it. Well, one, it felt clumsy, like to the extent that the goal was sort of alignment of crypto policy. It felt super clumsy, and dumb. And to the extent that it was sort of like broader, I think that like it was a known commodity, and part of why a lot of people were like interested in joining the company, that Sam had this very different idea about how to leverage wealth to make an impact in the world. So it wasn't surprising he was pretty vocal about this, right?
The effective altruism. And for the folks like for anyone listeners who don't know what that is, maybe just take a moment on that. But that was like, was effective altruism like discussed at like all hands and stuff? Was it actually like in the company culture?
Effective altruism and just the sort of for good mentality was very present. It was something that was discussed frequently. It was sort of a known commodity. It was something that people were excited about. And so, again, you have to remember that Sam was, as he was describing all these donations and things, the way that he was framing them was pandemic preparedness and stuff. It wasn't like a partisan political issues. It was sort of these big picture, the types of things that cohort of people were interested in. So it was surprising, but also like, again, kind of aligned with how Sam was clearly there to leverage money to remake the world, right? Like that was his goal. And so even though it was like, it felt way too soon and way too fast and way too aggressive in some ways, it wasn't, again, sort of out of sync with what you might have expected, kind of, with what his stated intentions were.
Going back to that Tuesday when you're at the Zoom call and he talks about the CZ, the Binance acquisition, had you and employees taken out your money out of FTX yet? Like, what was the story with that?
I don't. So I've been in New York the entire time, so I was never allowed to use FTX. So thanks, Letitia James, you protected me, New York Department of Financial Services. But I don't. I think some FTXers might have, but I don't think it was the norm to assume. But once withdrawals went down on Tuesday, they never came back. So I mean, there are like the head of institutional sales at FTX lost tens of millions of dollars in crypto assets there. So I don't think a lot of people, if you were paranoid enough to feel like, on Sunday or Monday, you had to get your assets out of FTX, you probably wouldn't have been at FTX. It was just, it's just too fast.
So this is the scale of like Enron plus Madoff combined, right? I mean, it is just enormous. I mean, if you're in SBF psychology, if you're in SBF's head, which I'm sure you've tried to put yourself in, and it's Monday, clearly made a ton of gaffes and a ton of dumb Twitter stuff. But after CZ had, owned him, is there anything that could have been saved, really? Or is it they're just done? They've committed the fraud and there's,
One of the biggest questions that just blew people's brains and did for the first, that first week and then the first couple of weeks after was, why not just let Alameda go? Like, why would you, like, FTX, it wasn't like FTX was genuinely making a ton of money. Like, it was public about how big our volume was. Now, some of that was juiced, it turns out. And it was public about what the exchange took for fees. It was making, hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And I think a lot of employees were like, why wasn't that enough for you, Sam? The problem, and this is something that I felt immediately so I'm hyper rational, and so I think about that, and I was like, well, there's only one possible solution. Like, these guys are smart people. Like, the reason that they didn't let Alameda go then is because there was something fundamentally entangled, fraudulent from the start, where if they had, it would have become clear. The game would have been up, right? So the only option was to dig deeper and hopefully they get to the other side. And that's what's happened. What's become clear is that from the very get-go, this was not like at some point they decided to go perpetrate fraud. It was the way that it was designed was not even fraudulent, like ignoring the norms of fraud and human behavior from the very beginning. So there was never any chance to disentangle these things because they were so elementally entangled.
Yeah. So he was just fucked. Basically, there's nothing he could have said on Slack that he could have.
But based on himself, like I think that your point is astute. Like, it's like it wasn't immediately clear why. Like, it wasn't immediately clear why not just let the dying limb, be severed type of thing. But in hindsight, it's clearer that there's
from a crisis comms perspective, it was just putting lipstick on a pig. Like, it was already done. Like, there was nothing he could have said on Slack earlier that would have made you guys feel better.
Oh, I mean, so the company it was a foregone conclusion once money started moving out, and once CZ sent that tweet, with how impaired it was in ways that we didn't know, that we were gone. Sam, his only chance was to convince another set of investors to put in enough that the hole was patched for long enough to regain confidence. To the extent, though, that you are asking, for people who find themselves in future crisis situations that weren't predicated on their unbelievable fraud, I do think that there are a leader in Sam's position could have communicated radically differently to the community and to markets. He did himself no favors. I think. Listen, if he had checked in every hour on Slack and said, "I'm so sorry, still no updates, but I'm here," like, everyone would have felt 500% better. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, still, it's just, you can't ghost. It is the number.
Ghosting is the thing, especially if that's not your personality. It was just like, it's just like so stark.
So counter.
It immediately put everyone on complete edge. Seeing that, I've been reading some pieces about like his brother's involvement and his parents' involvement. Like, these are all accusations. Maybe will be proved, maybe will be not, and some of the political stuff. But also many employees who are embroiled, especially at the top. I know you're not, so I just want to be very clear. But the question that I have is, I agree with you that you should not become this paranoid person who asks all these weird questions when you think of any job. But do you think at all differently as it relates to like your work email or things you see on Slack, or just like when you see that some things that people said in work emails or Slacks are like in being involved in a federal investigation now? Just does it imbue you with any other habits that you would like let someone know about now, who is not necessarily guilty of anything, but just in general?
So I don't say this to like pat myself on the back, but I like the night before everything, like the night before I resigned, because I resigned basically on Friday morning before the bankruptcy was declared. And the only reason I didn't resign on Thursday night was we were in the air and stuff. But I had one conversation that I won't get too much into detail with someone who is sort of not Sam or any of that inner circle, but close enough that it's pretty clear that there was nothing to be done. Like, I had no value to add. There was no process that we were going to be a part of. That there's just nothing more that I could do. And so I went through all of the communication that I'd ever had, and to some extent, it's like I was only ever like, if the feds want to know about our Super Bowl strategy, I'm certainly happy to help with that. But like, part of it's just, by virtue of what I was, but I also was like, I don't mind anyone reading any of these emails. Like, it just sort of like, and I think that the lesson is a stupid basic one, but it's just like, the more that you can act with sort of, integrity to yourself, like the less, it felt, it was very comforting to recheck that night on Thursday in the airport, the BA airport, waiting for a 12-hour flight, and be
I'm
like,
not worried about this.
Whatever. Yeah. I don't even need to, I don't even feel like I need to save any of these things,
Did you get a text? Did you get a text from Larry David being like, "What's happening?"
Wait, I do have one more detailed question, which is, who do you resign to? Like some operations person, like who? Like, is there this mass?
I resigned to Twitter, so I don't know.
So like, but this is a really perfunctory question, which is like, are people just like quitting everywhere? Like, who do you send an email to being like, I'm out? Like,
I told the general counsel of the U.S., who I knew was trying to get Sam to relinquish control. Yeah,
that makes sense. It's just weird.
A lawyer, the closest lawyer you can find was my answer. No, but I do want to go back to there's a really important thing though in terms of like this question of like, so behave different is one thing, but like view things differently, right? If we're saying you can't be hyper paranoid, I think that the behavior that was not even just out of sync with a startup, but is something that even if someone who is sort of totally above board has this behavior, it is really nerve-wracking in that sort of position of power, was the fact that Sam surrounded himself by people who didn't challenge him, like, and who were sycophantic and obsessed with him. And, it wasn't just his sort of the close compadres of people who have, now pled guilty to various charges, although they were certainly of that as well. It was like a number of the folks on the legal team. And like, when you see someone hiring like lawyers whose job it is to challenge everything and like push and, whatever, like when you're the CEO, that you have, especially of a startup, you have total power. Like you get to say yes or no to everything. Ultimately, that power should make you more, not less, willing to hear other viewpoints and to be challenged. And I think that to the extent that there was an extractable lesson, and this is something that I noticed, I didn't like that Sam always had these people who are so sycophantic and kind of, whatever around. I think that's part of why I was so excited when Brett came in, because he was very much not like that. Although, as he's revealed, he was almost instantly put on the outs because of that, and had his, Sam threatened to destroy his career just for challenging his authority. But that was a genuine red flag of, this is a person where the megalomania runs deeper than it should in this context.
Is your read that after this, the Binance acquisition fell through, of Sam, that he was just trying to save his reputation and thus do a media tour to try to win in the hearts of media, even though he knew he was facing legal persecution?
Maybe a little bit. I think that Sam has, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know how to diagnose it, but I think that he has a delusion that genuinely he is smarter and better than everyone else in the world at basically everything.
Which is why he's so convincing.
Yeah. And he believes them beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I really think my best explanation for all of this behavior is, I think that I do not believe that he was using all of this sort of effective altruism stuff to gain power for himself and to gain wealth. I believe that he genuinely wanted to go change the world, but I think it comes from a pernicious place of somehow convincing himself that he was the only person who could, that everyone was so deficient in their politics and so pathetic in their, you see that when that one reporter got to him when he thought he was off the record, it was like this mask being peeled back where he was just, he was just a ball of cynicism. And I just imagine, I said this on one of my podcasts, I just imagine him sitting there being so convinced that everyone else in the world was just too scared to do what he did. And that, of course, the rules are wrong and there's no such thing as ethics or morals. There's just power and who's willing to be bold enough to like really convinced, even now, and to probably the fucking day he dies, that he just happened to get caught this time, but he'd do it again 100 times. And only people who like speaking of in the arena, that like this man in the arena to the extreme, instead of thinking that there might be a possibility that other people every single day of their lives, when confronted with real moral or ethical quandaries, decide to do a thing that is right based on society standards or based on their inside, and that it's not that they don't see that there's this power game that they could play, it's that they choose not to, and my best explanation, of course, I don't know him, I'm not a psychologist, and I spent basically no time with him, but I really think that he thought that if he didn't save the world, no one would. And I actually think, though, to take it into another interesting dimension that's worth, I believe, exploring more societally, that's not just Sam, it is not surprising to me that he was rooted in a community that has gotten sort of like doom porn obsessed with AI misalignment. Yep. And I think that it foreshadows in some ways, and I think this might be one of the scarier parts, or just something that's to really hone in on. We are going to have massive societal debates that like dwarf these issues of crypto that we've been living in, around what society looks like in a post AI world, and how scared to be in, and what ways, and where optimism versus pessimism comes in. And the EA community in many ways got to that kind of faster than other communities, got into that conversation. And the response for many of them has been to basically feel like there's no other, like, if you don't work on that issue, you're literally wasting your time. It is the existential issue for all of humanity. And there's a bit of that sort of, again, it's like, we need a different word than even just megalomania. Just it's like being so convinced that the world doesn't get that this is the only thing to be spending time on, and nothing else matters and pales in comparison. So I think there's a little bit here, and some people have been talking about this, but I think we need to talk more about it. It's a warning shot to us a little bit of what, of some really important conversations that we need to have coming up.
Yeah, that's a great insight into what's at stake. A couple closing thoughts here, and Jesse, feel free to jump in as well. On my end, one, I'm curious, after Sam serves his sentence, whatever that is, what do you think he does next? What's the next chapter in his life? And then I'm also curious how you conceive of the role that Carolyn or Gary have played. Did they trust him until the end, and then they, had to save themselves? So
we realize that both things are speculation, but
of course,
please,
yeah. I think we all deserve to be able to speculate a little bit at this point.
Yes.
On the second question, from all that I've read, it sounds like, I guess maybe instead of speculating too much, I'll just kind of repeat what it seemed like and what maybe the natural conclusions from that were. It seems like Carolyn acted like she felt unburdened for the first time. And so, it's entirely possible that she kind of got into a situation that she was just, in over her head, but willing, every time she could have maybe stepped out, she chose not to. And I think that it seems like Nishad had much a similar reaction of really, like, maybe even not understanding how cynical Sam was about it. Like, and, I wonder about their relationship a little bit, because Nishad was one of the very few people that Sam actually listened to. Nishad was the head of engineering, but at the same time, he was like his younger brother's close friend from school. And like, I don't know how much there might've been just enough hero worship that, Sam respected Nishad's opinion about certain things, but, not in a way that challenged him. Gary, it sounded like, got lawyered up in the hell out of the Bahamas immediately, and no one knows anything about Gary. So, but it sounded like, from what I've read, like literally there were lawyers there by like Wednesday, and Gary was like, I'm gone. So he clearly knew that he had been a part of something wrong. It feels to me, perhaps, and I'll connect this to a point that I was making before, that even with those close confidants, it was still people that Sam was able to really, really control, and sort of be the dominant influence in their life over even their own sort of guiding sense of rightness or whatever. In terms of your first question of what I think Sam's
what's
next play
is like in his LinkedIn.
I hope it's teaching basic trading in jail for the next 70 years.
Or maybe he like does, I feel like the cool jobs for like previous criminals are like, you go work, like like the FBI taps you for like, what are other fraudsters working on? I don't know. Those are like the cool next jobs. But I have this term that I use for myself, charismatic mega founders. I don't know if you know the term charismatic megafauna, about like the big cute mammals like bears and elephants. Like those are the ones always used to raise money. And so that's where the dot connects for me. I feel like some of these founders are charismatic mega founders, where like they go out, they're raising gobs of money. It's just like how an elephant family can raise gobs of money for a zoo. But it's like, that was their skill. Like, and I'm not trying to paint as like that's the only skill, but it's just really interesting to question like why we follow certain people and who they surround themselves with. I thought that was an amazing point that you made, like pay attention to who they surround themselves with.
Yeah. I mean, I think you were kind of intimating a point when I was sort of on one of my rants, which is like, when someone is utterly convinced in their mission, even if it comes from a place of literal delusion, they can be highly compelling. From like that level of conviction is something that, investors pattern recognize.
It's appealing.
And it's especially because in a world of risk, like humans have to take risk, but what makes us comfortable with taking risk is conviction. And so when someone has enough conviction for everyone in the next 3 states, even if it's born of this incredible place, so it's kind of like, I don't know. I think we could have a whole different conversation about venture capitalists and pattern matching, and why, challenging pattern recognition, not just sort of leaning into it, might be a good thing for the world. But yeah, it's certainly not as crazy as it might seem that so many people were sort of sucked in by this.
Yeah. And maybe in closing, this has been devastating to obviously all the employees, you included. How did you rebuild momentum, rebuild confidence? How did you bounce back from being so burned?
I mean, I'm very lucky that I wasn't one of these employees who had my whole life, into it. Like I never lost myself in it though. Like, and I was just fortunate, like, because I've always had this podcast that was, a weird thing for a lot of people in FTX, that I was like, why, when you're on this rocket ship, would you also be wasting time doing this other little podcast or whatever? For a lot of people, it was like so weird, but I was able to just kind of shift back into that. And there were all these things that I had sort of put on pause or deferred for a couple of years to see where this journey led, that I sort of just jumped right back into that. But like I said, I was super fortunate relative to a lot of folks. And, I think, feel very grateful for that, even in the context of a pretty tough few months.
Well, Nathaniel, thank you for sharing your story of being in the arena with us. It's a hell of a journey for sure. We highly recommend that people check out your episode, Sam Bankman-Fried, on the breakdown, and just your podcast in general, which gives a great overview. Thanks so much for joining us, Nathaniel.
Yeah,
thank
glad
you
to
so
be here.
much. Thanks for listening to In the Arena. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like, subscribe, and share by leaving us a review and telling everyone you know. And please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter at inthearena_pod. We'd love your suggestions on who else has an intense experience to share.